All right, so I'd like to welcome everyone to our April Birders Night. And so thank you everyone for gathering. And before I get started, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And on this beautiful spring day, I am grateful. Before we hand it over to the speaker, I'd like to ask Kelvin to introduce our speaker, please.
And yeah, I'd like to introduce Franklin. Frank is with the Stanley Park Ecology Society. Yeah, okay, I got that right. I actually met I'm Frank in person for the first time on one of their owl prowls this past fall slash winter. And before then, I had actually been aware of Frank. He's great photographer. He's got his Instagram page, which you should check out for some really neat bird photos. Some other background on Frank, he has a Bachelor of Science at SFU, biochemistry and molecular biology. And with SPES, he conducts monthly bird walks around Lost Lagoon and Beaver Lake. And in 2023, he was featured. His photo of the orcas breaching near Brockton Point made a CBC article, so that was really cool.
Mhm.
So yeah, I'd like to introduce Frank and thank you for giving us this presentation.
So thank you, Kelvin, for the introduction. This is just some more information about Stanley Park Ecology, who we are. We are a charity nonprofit organization based out of Stanley Park, and we provide wildlife and ecosystem monitoring. That's what I do as part of my job with SPES. Um, we when I say SPES, I refer to Stanley Park Ecology Society. That's our long name, although our name now is just Stanley Park Ecology. We also do some educational trips with school field trips as well as public programs. So this type of a webinar would be under public programs. And we also have our ecology center, our nature house is open for the public on weekends from 10 to 4. You're welcome to stop by and meet me there and share some of your observations around the park. It's right along Lost Lagoon, so it's a great spot for firsthand observations within the park as well. We have a spotting scope that's set up, and you can take a look there whenever it's open. And in the summer, we also have a roving volunteer program, the Eco Rangers, that move around the park to answer people's questions and to show them around. And again, to acknowledge that we are on Stanley Park, as it is so called, is part of the unceded ancestral lands of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations, and it's important that we consider that in mind. I'm actually in Surrey right now, in North Surrey, and I would also like to acknowledge that I am on the traditional unceded lands of the Katzie and the Kwantlen, Kakite, and Semiahmoo nations, to name a few. So it's important to keep that in mind and to respect the land we're on. Here are some of the other events that we have for April. So we have a cherry blossoms walk coming up this weekend. You can find more information on our website to buy tickets online. We also have an eagle event as well on the 16th. And then I'm also doing a bird walk on April 19th. This is called That's Not a Duck. So this event will be focused on water birds that aren't ducks. So geese and cormorants, loons. I see that we had a little bit of a discussion earlier with the loons and grebes. So I'm hoping that we can find some of those during this walk on April 19th. It's on a Saturday at 9:30 and we start at the Nature House. So today's theme is gulls, and this presentation is all about the glorious gulls. Um, Down here is my Instagram handle, and you're welcome to follow this for more bird photos. And so, unless noted, most of the pictures in this presentation are my own. This is a list of some of the things we'll be talking about today. We'll go into a brief overview of what's a gull exactly. And most of this presentation is really centered on our most prolific common gull species, the glaucous wing gulls, and their relatives and their hybrids of such that are derived from glaucous wing gull. We'll go into gull behavior and biology, as well as nesting and aging of gulls. And then there will be some closing remarks. And I will send these slides at the very end of the presentation. And I'm not sure how we will be for time, but there are additional gull species. If we don't get the time, I can just send this set to you for further review. So starting out, I thought I'd just open up with this question. What do you think of gulls? Give me your honest thoughts into the chat box. Um, Gulls, I think no other bird has such a polarizing reaction among birders and observers in general. So it's really good. We have a wide variety of impressions here. Ratbirds, huge rise, and hard to identify, very underrated. Yeah, so maybe I will change your point of view of gulls, maybe I won't. But here are some reasons what I think of gulls. I think um they're often very overlooked and very underrated, underappreciated, I feel like. But they're kind of a great stepping stone into birding in that they're easy to observe. You see them in a wide variety of habitats. They are also a big ID challenge to overcome in many situations. Even the most experienced birders feel very humbled by the difficulty of identifying gulls. And they're also an important indicator of local ecosystems as generalist, opportunistic predators, and the cleanup crew in many situations. And they're a lot more than meets the eye because there's so many different things that are kind of underappreciated about their gull behavior. If you look at a book about gulls, it's great for identification. For example, I have the Gull Guide here by Mar A.S. This is a really nice book for identification. But I feel like a lot of gull books don't quite go into gull behavior as much as I hope they would. One book I do recommend is called The Herring Gull's World by Nico Tinbergen. This was a book published back in 1953, and it talks about herring gulls, but the same holds true for many different gull species. I like to think of this presentation here more like the glaucous wing gulls universe. So will be mostly centered on the glaucous wing gull and its cousins and some of the interesting behaviors there are. So, what exactly is a gull? So the next slide. Gulls are part of a very wide, diverse group of birds. They're in this order known as Ceratoriformes, which also contains the shorebirds and the alcids and a few other groups as well. They form a distinct group, the gulls and the relatives, in this clade here, and they share this family with the terns, Laridae. They are also distantly related to, or they're closely related to the Astuas and the Jaeger, but those are generally considered to be a different family. So here's one family of birds, Laridae, and they're divided into two subfamilies. We have the terns, like this Tasman tern on the left, and then we have the gulls, which are part of the Larinae subfamily. And this is the glaucous winged gull here on the right. There's about 50 species of gulls throughout the world. Depends who you ask. Some people will split certain species, other people will group them together. Um, of which the most predominant genus is known as Larus. These are the large white-headed gulls. Many of them are pretty large looking with white heads. And there are four species that are particularly common here in Vancouver, the most prolific of which is the glaucous winged gull here on the top left. But the other three we see at some point throughout the year. So these are kind of the more common type species. We have the ring-billed gull, the short-billed gull, and the California gull. These three are more migratory, but they are more common than some of the other gull species we'll talk about later. The glaucous winged gull stands out among them. It's the only one in this group that does not have black wingtips and has pink feet. So you can see the wingtips, the primaries are about the same color as the mantle, whereas the other ones have yellowish feet. The ring-billed gull you see in a wide variety of areas. Um, the short-billed gull is the more migratory one. You see them mostly through the winter, and they migrate in large flocks. And same holds true for the California gull. They're more sparse around here, but we do get some flocks of them that come here through the late fall and also in the spring as well. Other types of gulls include this is other types of gulls include the hooded gulls. So these are smaller species that have black heads in breeding season. Here are two species of such. We have the Bonaparte's gull, which is the most common species of the hooded gulls here in Vancouver. And they only have the hood in breeding plumage. So here on the right, we have a Bonaparte's gull in breeding plumage, and on the left is how we usually see them through the winter, where they have a white head with this black ear spot. And they're distinctive in that they're very small, very tern-like in their flight. And the Bonaparte skull also has this kind of white edge to the wing, which is one way to identify them from a distance. Another species that is occasionally seen, this is one of the rarer of the hooded gulls, is the Franklin's gull. So this one on the right here, it's one of my favorite gull species, partly because it's called Franklin. Um, this one, it's only occasionally seen. They're mostly breeding in the central North America, and then they usually move through the central flyways instead of the Pacific flyways. But usually, a few immatures get lost along the way and they follow the coastal Pacific flyways, like this one here, and they winter down in South America. They're one of the farthest migrating of the gulls. And as an adult, one unusual thing is that they have complete molts, two complete molts per year, whereas other gulls have only one complete body molt and one partial molt per year. Other gull species also include I don't have any pictures of this one, but kittiwakes are sometimes considered the true seagull in that they nest in offshore cliffs and they're more pelagic than other gull species. The black-legged kittiwake is a rare visitor to Vancouver, but it's quite uncommon overall. So I thought we'd do a deep dive right into the glaucous winged gull and as the most prolific gull species in Vancouver, as well as its relatives and its hybrid offspring as well. Here's a pair of glaucous wing type gulls, and I'll explain why I say that in the next few slides. So to review, glaucous wing gulls are the most common of the large gull types in Vancouver. Um, and the word glaucous refers to the bluish gray of the wings and of the mantle. There is also a glaucous gull, which is a different species, not to be confused. That is a rarer Arctic species, which I will discuss more later into this presentation. But the glaucous wing gull is a pretty large Larus gull, and it has this very concolorous color profile. So here, that's one way that they stand out is that they don't have black wingtips compared to other gulls. They also have a pretty large bulbous bill, this kind of strong angle with this red spot called the gonies. Um, Many gulls have this gony spot, but the shape of the bill on a glaucous winged gull is quite large and bulbous, comparable to the western gull, which is another large gull species that it interbreeds with. The eye of a glaucous winged gull is usually quite dark, but this can be variable. Some birds do have paler eyes. There is some debate if such birds are hybrids or not, but it seems like in some northern parts they do have pale eyes, even away from the hybrid zones. This is just a general topography of what a gull's parts look like. So when I refer to the gony spot, I'm referring to this red spot at the base of the bill. And there is an interesting story about what this spot is used for by the chicks. Um, the hood is this dark marking over the head. And this is only seen in the winter or basic plumage. And the summer they will molt this out, so they get an all white head in their breeding plumage. The mantle refers to the whole back feathers here, including the scapulars and the rest of the body here. So collectively, this whole area is called the mantle, which contrasts with the primaries, which are the wingtips over here. And then you have the tertials, which are the back part of the hind part of the wing, and the secondaries, which is this front part of the wing that forms the inner section of the wing when the bird's wing is open. So again, to reiterate, glaucous winged gulls have their primaries are about the same shade as their mantle. And so this really stands out when you see them in flight. There is some debate as to how dark their primaries can be for a pure glaucous winged gull. Some people would consider the ones that are any darker than the mantle to be hybrids, but that's still kind of up for debate. Um, so the primaries can be numbered from 1 to 10 from the inside to the outside. And these outer primaries have what were called mirrors. So this outermost primary is called P10. And in glaucous winged gulls, they usually have a mirror on the P10 and sometimes on the second outermost primary as well. So these are P9 and P10. They also have what's known as the string of pearls. So this is this white spots that go along the inner primaries. In these things are called tongue tips. So the gray sections of these inner primaries form these long tongue tips, and at the very tips are these white spots. And so when birders are talking about string of pearls, they're referring to these white spots at the base. This is quite variable for a glaucous winged gull. They're one of the most varied in terms of their wing pattern, but these are some traits that people use to identify some of the other gull species. For example, the slaty back gull is a rare East Asian relative to glaucous winged gull. It has black wingtips and a dark mantle, but it also has a similar string of pearls, unlike the western gull, which does not have that. The glaucous winged gulls have a pretty wide geographic range along the northern Pacific, and they are found in coastal marine environments. Some populations are more migratory than others. So we are here in the Pacific Northwest, and we get a mix of both the migratory populations and resident populations. Our resident populations are mostly hybrids with the western gulls. So these ones generally stick here year round. But glaucous winged gulls do overlap with quite a few other gull species. So up north here in southern Alaska, they overlap with the American herring gull, and then up north was the glaucous gull, and then in East Asia they also overlap with the slaty back gull. It's generally considered there's no distinct subspecies of glaucous winged gull, but there is considerable geographic variation, which is often attributed to this hybridization with these types of gulls. Some of these are pretty well studied, like the Western gull hybridization, and also to some extent the American herring, but others are poorly understood, like the slatyback in East Asia. But to keep it short, you could consider that there are two different populations of Loch-Ness winged gulls here. You have the resident Pacific Northwest birds. These often have very, both the males and females are very bulky looking. They're very bulbous in their bill shape. And they have a pretty strong contrast between the mantle and the primaries, which tend to be a bit darker. And this likely reflects the hybridization with the Western gull, whereas there are northern types, which a lot of these look purer and they have paler mantles and paler primaries, although some of them also might reflect the American herring gull hybridization, so they could have slightly darker primaries. One interesting thing that I have noted, and this is only anecdotal because there hasn't really been a lot of studies on these geographic variation of Glaucus winged gulls, but there's been a lot of anecdotal accounts from many observers that the northern Glaucus winged gulls, they tend to be more dainty looking. The females especially are quite small with shorter bills, and it's presumed that most of these are the smaller females, or there's just a lot of size variation and greater sexual dimorphism in these northern populations. But that's one of the big mysteries. We don't really know for sure what's really going on between the two populations. But they seem to be two different groups. They do hang out together in the wintertime, but there are some slight differences in their habitat preference as well. The Western gull is it's similar to the Glaucus winged gull in its body shape, although surprisingly, it's actually not the closest genetic relative. It's the closest geographically here, and they do interbreed quite a bit. But it basically has a similar body shape to Glaucus winged gulls with a large bulbous bill, but it has a darker mantle, this dark gray back, and jet black primaries. And they breed along the coast from Washington, Oregon, down to California. And they're quite uncommon inland and also quite uncommon this up north in around Vancouver. Part of this is because the requirements for what's considered a pure Western gull is quite stringent around here. So there's a lot of birds that are very close to pure Western gull, but they get rejected because their primaries are a bit too pale or their mantle's too pale. This one was seen a few years ago at Thornton Park in near Main Street Science World Station. And this was considered a good Western gull. You can see close with the glaucous winged gull beside it here, the difference in the mantle shade and in the primaries. The two species interbreed and they produce what's known as the Olympic gull. And many of our resident gulls are actually of this hybrid combination. So they combine the two traits in terms of the primaries being more of a dark gray, but not completely black. And the mantle is usually darker than glaucous winged gulls as well. We also have this head smudging pattern that is derived from glaucous winged gulls. And whereas the Western gull does not have this smudging pattern, and the bill often looks a bit more bulbous than the pure glaucous winged gull. Some of the glaucous winged gulls do have bulbous bills, but it just looks more disproportionate in some of these hybrids. There is a great variation between between the types of hybrids. The ones farther south look more like Western gull, so like the one on the left over here. At first glance, this looks like a Western gull, but the primaries are not black. They're more of a dark gray. And also there's this smudging pattern on the head, which is not considered to be a Western gull trait usually. And on the right here, we have one that looks very much like a pure glaucous winged gull, and it usually would be considered as such. But one difference that between the two species is the eye orbital coloration. So the Western gull has this yellow eye orbital, whereas the glaucous winged gull has a pink eye orbital. So if you see any yellow on the eyes of one of these birds, then it's very likely to be a partial hybrid. So this bird is overall like a glaucous winged gull, except that it has yellow on the orbital. It's hard to say for sure with some of these, even though it's very likely to be a hybrid. It's kind of hard to draw the line at times and how much hybridization is still considered a good species. So for simplicity purposes, a lot of the gulls, like the one on the right here, we collectively refer to these as glaucous wing type gulls. And that's how I'm going to refer to the birds moving on in this presentation. We're going to be talking a bit about hybrids as well as pure birds, but primarily when I say glaucous wing type, I'm referring to them collectively.
Frank, there's a
Yes.
question. Is the Western white all year, um, like the head part, is it white all year round?
Oh, that's a good question. So in the fall, gulls have what's called the prebasic molt, so that produces the non-breeding plumage. And in the pure Western gull, they do have a little bit of a hood marking during that time. So in that non-breeding plumage, they do have some dark hood markings, but it's very subtle usually, and it abrades due to environmental conditions very quickly. So um, their hood markings wear off pretty early on, and usually by the winter, they already have a pretty clean white head. Um, there is debate as to how much is too much for a pure Western gull. That's still kind of up in the air, but generally, when identifying Western gulls in this area, they are pretty strict on that's one of the criteria that they shouldn't have much, if any, of the head smudging there.
Okay, great, thanks.
I feel like that is kind of a arbitrary limit that we as humans like to identify animals and we split hairs sometimes. So it's still kind of a it's still kind of open-ended in terms of what you and I consider to be hybrid or not. And so you might be wondering why these hybrids seem to be very prevalent. Well, there's a few theories as to why this is. One of these is called bounded hybrid superiority. This is where, because these hybrids do interbreed with one another and with their parent species, and they can produce fertile offspring, that um, they are able to prevail in certain environmental conditions. And there was a study done a few years ago that looked at this. Here's one of the other studies that shows the hybrid zone. So we can see that around BC, around northern Washington, there's kind of a mix of where hybrids, which are ones in gray, they are more numerous than the either parent species. And then moving up north, we have more pure glaucous winged gulls. Moving south, we have more western gulls. And so there have been a few studies that have been looking at what seems to be this hybrid superiority, where in certain conditions, there the hybrids seem to be more evolutionarily fit. They seem to prevail more. And one thing that was noted is that these hybrids tend to prefer eating more fish, like Western gulls, whereas the glaucous winged gulls tend to prefer more mollusks and other invertebrates. So that could help them in certain conditions. In the southern part of the hybrid zone, so down here, um, the hybrids are seem to have more breeding success because they pick areas, nesting sites that are more densely covered and less out in the open than the Western gulls. And they also have a higher clutch size. So there seems to be certain areas, and here in Vancouver, it seems like these hybrids are also somewhat more adapted to urban life. We get these really big gulls that you see in urban parks all around. And so it seems like these hybrids do prevail more in certain areas than the parent species. It remains to be seen how this is in the long run. There seems to be, in some cases, this equilibrium where, depending on weather conditions and depending on fishing success, that purer birds tend to do better in certain conditions than the hybrids. But this is still something that requires further study. So another related gull that sometimes hybridizes with the glaucous winged gull is called the American herring gull. This one was recently split from the European herring gull, as well as the Vega gull and the Mongolian gull. Although for purposes of this presentation, if I'm mentioning herring gull, I'm referring to the American herring gull. This is slightly smaller than the glaucous winged gull and the western gull, and this is a pale-eyed species with a light mantle as well as black primaries. And often we see them in the winter. They are abundant throughout North America, but here around Vancouver, we mainly only see them migrating through in the winter. And they have this streaky hood pattern in the winter compared to the more smudgy pattern of the glaucous winged gull. They do hybridize with glaucous winged gulls in Alaska. These hybrids are also quite common in BC. Here is an American herring gull compared to a glaucous wing type gull here on the left. They have a paler mantle. I think part of this is only due to the fact that a lot of gulls like these are back across Olympics. But you can see that the difference here with the pale eye and the streaky hood compared to the smudgy hood of the glaucous wing gull and the jet black wingtips. Here's another example as well. This was at Lost Lagoon a few years ago in 2021. The previous picture was from Port Moody recently. So herring gulls tend to be kind of few and far, and in recent years there has been kind of a more stricter reporting method on eBird, for example. You have to provide pictures and a description before because there were a lot of people that have misreported hybrids or both the glaucous winged gull western hybrids and the glaucous winged gull west or herring hybrids as herring gulls. So these are examples that are considered to be pure. They do hybridize though with the glaucous winged gull, and these hybrids are known as the Cook Inlet gull because they're found in the Cook Inlet region of Alaska. So right up around Anchorage seems to be one area where the hybrids are much more prevalent than either parent species. These hybrids are quite variable, perhaps even more so than the Olympic gull hybrid, the glaucous winged western hybrids. And they often have both traits of both parents, but sometimes they do seem to lean more towards one than the other. This one here is kind of a classic looking, well, it has this pale eye and at first glance looks like a herring gull, but it has the smudgy head pattern of the glaucous winged gull. There are others that are more variable, so we have ones that are more glaucous winged gull-like, like the one on the left here. And the one in the middle is kind of more intermediate, has a darker eye like Blackish Wingull, but has this blackish wingtips. And then the one on the right looks very much like a pure herring gull at first glance, but something just looks off. I think it's the large bulbous bill and this kind of faded look to the head streaking as well. So it can be sometimes difficult to draw the line, especially for the birds that look more glaucous wing gull-like. Here are two examples. The one on the left, I would say, is more hybrid-like. The one on the right actually looks more like a glaucous wing gull. Um, and such birds are actually pretty common in East Asia, where there is less hybridization with this species, although there's some debate if those East Asian birds could have back gull or if there's just more variation in glaucous wing gulls in those areas where there isn't as much hybridization going on. So the case of these two gulls, I would say the left one is a hybrid with a herring gull, and the one on the right is arguably a pure glaucous wing gull, but some people would disagree with that. Here's another case that was very interesting. So this is one bird that I've actually seen over the past few years, and This is presumed to be a female glaucous winged gull because it's much smaller, much more dainty looking, almost like the shape of an Iceland gull. But this is a glaucous winged gull, and the first time I saw it, it looked like it had pretty dark primaries, and part of it was due to the lighting. So you can see here, in certain lighting conditions, they can look quite dark with darker looking primaries than the mantle. But then in direct sunlight, you can see that it does look more uniform. Um, and this is what's considered still to be a pure glaucous wing gull, just kind of on the darker extreme of variation of the wingtips. Just thought it was interesting because I've seen this individual over the past few years at White Rock Pier. Actually, more recently, I saw the same bird at Bryden Lagoon in Langley. So it's interesting how sometimes these individual birds do stand out quite a bit. And this is just to recap the differences between the glaucous wing gull, western gull, and the American herring gull, as well as the hybrids thereof. So I'll send you the slide, and hopefully this will be of some help. Next, we'll move on to the exciting world of the ecology of gulls. So gulls can be found in a wide variety of habitats. They occupy both marine intertidal zones, but they also can be found in open fields and urban environments. So this inner city park, you can see there's a lot of gulls gathering together, and people have been feeding them in this park. And one interesting thing is that there seems to be some overlap between different types of gulls, but also some of them do prefer certain areas more than others. For example, the Olympic gulls, you get them in both areas, but then the northern glaucous wing gulls, you get them more in open fields and less urban environments than the Olympic gulls. Gulls are primarily carnivorous, but they are also opportunistic. So they eat primarily marine invertebrates, fish, but they are also scavengers. So they'll eat carrion and garbage. I mentioned how Western gulls and hybrids tend to prefer more fish, whereas glaucous winged gulls tend to prefer more mollusks and sea stars. That's probably true to some extent, but you'll see both. So here we have, I would say that both of all of these are Olympic gulls, but you can see that sometimes they're trying to get the sea stars in their mouths, and they have to wait for all the arms to kind of move and converge in one spot before swallowing it down. Other times they will dive for fish. So this buckus wing type gull here is eating what I believe this is a northern anchovy, but they are also quite predatory. So gulls can also go after bird eggs and small birds, as well as chicks, including their own kind. So they can be also cannibalistic. There are a few different ways that gulls look for food. One of these is called paddling. This is how they look for invertebrates such as earthworms and marine worms. So they will stomp their feet on the ground and kind of patter along. And this is supposed to bring those animals up to the surface. They usually do this for after the rain has stopped, or in the case here, it's in the middle of the ocean as the tide is moving. And then on the right, this Olympic gull is actually eating a worm. I'm trying to see the picture. It grabbed a worm. It didn't have to do the paddling this time. In this case, the lawns were recently mowed, so it was just picking out from the grass. Gulls often also plunge dive for food. They're able to kind of dive from midair to get fish. However, because their bodies are so buoyant, they can only go underneath for about 1 meter. And in large fish runs, you get these huge swarms of gulls that go after this big shoal of fish. They also look for areas where there's other animals that are looking, for example, seals and sea lions. And a few years ago, we had this big northern anchovy run where you can see here, this is a northern anchovy, and the gulls were going after them. And then underneath, there were a lot of California sea lions that were also going after the same food. I'll show you a quick video of this event. This was quite a spectacle. to behold. It's only the second time I've actually seen this. A few years before this, there was a similar event at White Rock, but this was at the Cole Harbor, Devonian Harbor in Stanley Park, and right under that rowing club area. There's the sea lions there. So this was quite a sight to behold, and I remember this only lasted for about 2 months, so December and January. It's believed that in El Nino years, these northern anchovies are more of a warm water fish. They move up north, and the sea lions, which are primarily males, because the females stay south to take care of the young, the male California sea lions move up north, and they follow these fish, and the gulls follow them as well. Although no sooner as it started, it ended as around at some point in after this started, there was a big cold snap. I think it was in the middle of January, and after that, the anchovies left the area and the sea lions followed suit. But during this time, was an opportunity to see some other birds as well. So there was actually a glaucous gull in the area. The glaucous gull is a Arctic breeding gull, and it has white wingtips. It's considered the second largest gull species in the world. So they're pretty large, although the ones that we get here, many of them are of the Alaskan subspecies, which are smaller, but they're still about the same size, if not bigger, than the glaucous wing type gulls we have. The immatures, this is one species where I feel like the juveniles and immatures are quite striking. They have this all white body with this bicolored bill. So this pink bill with this black tip. And so one of these gulls was hanging around during that time when the sea lions were there. On the bottom here is what the adult looks like. So very similar to the glaucous wing and the herring gull overall, but with white wing tips and a whiter mantle and pale eyes here. This was in Delta a few years before that. Here's an example of the glaucous gull with a glaucous wing gull of the first and second cycles. So one trait I mentioned was the bicolored bill. Some of the glaucous wing gulls do have a bicolored bill as well, but that's only in the second cycle usually. Whereas in the first cycle, so the first year that they don't have that. And this is not necessarily a characteristic of hybridization, but they do sometimes hybridize and they produce some intermediate looking birds. This is the glaucous gull when it started snowing. I just happened to get this image one day. It was pretty clear that day in the afternoon, and then suddenly by the evening it started snowing. So that was kind of the beginning of the end for the anchovy run when we had that cold snap. But while it was there, here's one interesting image. It looks almost like these California sea lions had their first look at the glaucous gull there. It's like a lifer bird for the sea lions as well. Another species that was also present was the Thayer's gull. This is a slightly smaller species than the glaucous wing gull, and it somewhat resembles the Olympic gull hybrids and the Cook Inlet hybrids. This one we do get in winter a few times, but they are less numerous than the other gull species usually. They are now considered a subspecies of the Iceland gull, but they have darker wingtips than those other subspecies. Um, they have this the eye can be dark to pale and it's surrounded by a pinkish purplish orbital skin. And the coloration kind of resembles the glaucous wing types overall, the glaucous wing hybrids. But the one way that you can distinguish them is when they're in flight. As juveniles, they have this Venetian blind pattern, this kind of dark and white alternating pattern on the primaries. And when they're an adult, they have these long tongue tips with a string of pearls, but they also have this kind of, they call this the Thayer's wing pattern, where the P9 has this white mirror that kind of goes in and out. So that's the Thayer's gull. And now I'll talk about the feeding, back to the feeding behaviors of gulls. Um, so other ways that gulls will hunt for food is they will steal off other birds, including their own kind, as well as other birds as well. So this is called kleptoparasitism. Here we have a young glaucous wing type gull that's trying to steal food from these Barrow's goldeneyes. So it was looking for these big groups that are eating mussel and it was trying to steal off of them. They also chase after each other. So here's two glaucous wing gulls that are um, going in an aerial chase for food. There was one interesting count where this common goldeneye female was looking for, I believe it was hunting crabs, and this Olympic gull was in the area and it just kept diving after the goldeneye, and eventually it did catch a crab. So it did steal one food item that the goldeneye was trying to eat. Gulls will also drop food to try and break it. This seems like a very ingenious way to look for food. Although there is some debate whether this is in it or if they actually learn this behavior, but they will drop it onto different surfaces to try and crack these shells open. They also sometimes do this for fun. So gulls will sometimes drop catch as a way to play with one another and to learn as well. But there is quite some debate as to whether this is an innate or learned behavior. Back when Nico Tinbergen wrote his Herring Gulls World book, he thought that they weren't really learning from it because often they would drop items onto the mud and they would just keep doing it until they give up. But more recent studies have shown that gulls do show some signs of learning. They probably look at other gulls in the area when they're young and they eventually learn to drop things onto harder surfaces if they can. Sometimes they will just plop it on the ground. They won't even fly up to drop things. So in this case here, this Olympic gull, it flew onto the concrete of the seawall over here and it kept dropping it from standing height, but it wasn't flying up and dropping it as the other one earlier was doing here. So there's a few theories as to why this is, and maybe they're more smarter than we think, because one theory is that it reduces the risk of kleptoparasitism. So these gulls are not making as much of a scene when they're dropping it from a lower height, and they're more likely to keep the food item as theirs. And also, sometimes these items are probably too heavy to fly up and drop them. So there's probably an energy cost there that it's not worth dropping it from like flying and then dropping because that uses up more energy. Here's another case of a dropping food dropping gull. This is a glaucous wing type in its first winter, first cycle, and it was dropping this sea urchin, and it was eventually able to crack it open and eat the meat inside. Another feeding method that gulls will do is they will catch insects midair. Glaucous wing gulls do this occasionally, but you see this more in the inland breeding gull species. So things like the ring-billed gull, California gull, as well as short-billed gulls. Um, and they will kind of swoop up in the middle of the air. They'll sometimes swarm in big flocks to try and catch these bugs. This is a ring-billed gull that's hawking for insects, and it's quite a sight to behold, especially in the late summers. That's when we get these insects, probably some midges or some chafer beetles in the area, and these big flocks of gulls just kind of swarm around for a bit, and they catch these insects midair. Next, we'll talk about the breeding cycle of gulls, which is always quite interesting. Here in BC, I mentioned that glaucous-winged gulls nest throughout the northern Pacific, but here in BC, these are some of the areas that they have been documented breeding, mostly on offshore islands with low relief, as well as some urban areas, so rooftops and bridges. The biggest colonies are off the coast of BC. So we have on Vancouver Island, Middlemark Island, Mandart Island, the Chain Islets, as well as Cleveland Island off the west coast here. And then up north in Haida there's also quite a few breeding populations as well. Some of these are more hybrids than others. So down here around Vancouver Island, most of the gulls in the Salish Sea are Olympic gull hybrids, whereas the ones up north are considered pure. Nesting season takes place between April and May, and this is when the gull actively start to nest. But earlier on in February, birds start to arrive at their breeding grounds. The males will advertise these nesting sites in April and May before nesting and pairing actually begins. And nest building, so they build with twigs and various materials, that takes place around late April to May. Unpaired birds form what are called clubs. So these immature birds, they sometimes start pairing up when they are younger. They form these clubs where they're trying to actively look for mates. Generally, at first glance, male and female gulls look the same, but females are up to 20% smaller than the males. So this is one example here where the male is on the left here with looks a little bit more bulky with a larger bill, whereas the female usually has a more straighter looking bill. Gulls are quite faithful to one another. They are very strongly monogamous. And even there have been some studies on gull chicks in a nest, and they found that there are next to very little cases where the chicks in a nest are not fathered by the father of the nest. So they tend to be quite good parents and not cheating on one another. So during nesting, there are a wide variety of display behaviors that gulls will do to defend their territory and to look for nesting sites. So that's what we have here. We have the upright display, the oblique long call display, the choking display, and grasp hold. So I'll discuss this a bit, but the upright display is what we call an intention display. This is where the gull is standing upright and it's asserting its aggression. And depending on the position of the bill, it can be showing more aggression when it's moving its head down. When it's moving its bill up, it's more submissive. The oblique long call is used to signal for territory and advertise and direct threats at potential trespassers. And this is the call that they make. So this is the oblique long call. So this one over here. On the bottom left here, we have what's called choking. This is quite an interesting behavior. This is where a gull will kind of crouch on its knees and it will whack its head and body kind of in this manner, in this position. And during this time, they make this very interesting kind of hooting sound. It kind of sounds like the sound of an owl, kind of overlaid with long call sounds. And this is what it sounds like. So this choking display, it's used to signal the territory, and it's also used by pairs when they are looking for a nest site. So they will walk around their territory and they'll kind of choke around different areas and be like, well, you're gonna nest here, you're gonna nest there. They're gonna actively look for their nesting sites. And the last behavior is called grass pulling. This one is quite interesting because at first glance, it looks like these gulls are gathering nesting material, and this is how they do sometimes gather their nesting material. But this is actually a territorial aggression display by rival males at territorial boundaries. Sometimes it's done by younger birds as well. So here we have a second cyclotype Buckus wing type with the adult here, and they're both doing the grass pulling as if this is their territorial boundary. This is what is known as a displacement behavior. It's kind of like when we are fidgeting or when we're trying to displace an action that we want to project on something. So for in the case of this, it's threatening the rival that it's gonna tear the rival apart like it's plucking the grass. And sometimes this leads to a full-on fight. So here's a group of three gulls in the middle of a territorial dispute. I'll show you a short video of this. You see that grass pulling behavior there. They're choking. And so there is some overlap between the courtship behaviors as well as the territorial behaviors. So the kind of slower sounding call you heard there is called the mew call, and it's also used by pairs to recruit one another. So here's a pair of gulls doing this. It's called a mewing oblique display, where they're walking around with their heads kind of leaning a bit. And the choking display is used to look for nesting sites and to signal territory to rivals. And then we have the head toss. The head toss has several different purposes, but it's used before mating. So the male and the female will take turns throwing their heads up and calling until the male mounts and mates with the female. It's also used by the female to beg for food from the male and from young birds to beg for food from their parents. Gulls almost always lay three eggs, and this takes place between May to June. Um, the adults have three bare patches of skin called brood patches on their belly, which coincides with these three eggs. Sometimes they do lay more eggs or less eggs, depending on the conditions. Incubation takes place for up to 28 days, and about 2 days before the eggs hatch, the chicks can actually be heard piping from their eggs. So the adult can actually hear them, and they will actually reorient the position of the egg such that they are better able to hatch. The babies are born semi-preputial, which means that they are able to walk and thermoregulate on their own. They have this coat of natal down, but they're unable to venture that far from their nesting grounds. The babies are fed between 5 to 9 times a day, depending on the clutch size, and they're mostly fed things that the adult will regurgitate. This includes fish and other marine animals as well. And so one way that the chick tries to beg for food is the red goni spot on the bill. This was a seminal study done by Nico Tinbergen in his book Herringul's World. He describes this in detail, and it's where these chicks will keep pecking at this red spot on the bill to beg for food. And this is one page from the book that shows that when the bill spot is red, the chicks respond the most. So they have 100%. 100 times of the response when they are presented with a puppet that has this red spot compared to the other colors. Now, it's still not known why this only holds true for the gulls with the red bill spots. There's, of course, other gull species like ring-billed gull, triple gull that do not have these spots. So maybe they have some other visual cues, or they have other ways of feeding their young that don't require this. But this seems to hold true for all the red-billed gulls. And here's another family of gulls. The adult regurgitated these crabs, and the chicks tried nibbling it, but I think it was still too big for them. So the adult actually swallowed them back. And maybe it keeps it for itself, or maybe it's going to regurgitate it again for the chicks sometime later. So in the first year, the survival rate's not particularly high. About 40% of glaucous winged gulls survive their first winter. There are a variety of factors such as predation from both their own kind and from other predators like this bald eagle here. This gull here has been injured, so you can see that it has its wings spread out. There was kind of a joke at the time that this kind of looks like a chicken gull. But often the bald eagles can hunt gulls both in the nest as well as fledged juveniles as well. I've even seen them take down adults as well. And the average lifespan of a glaucous winged gull is about 9.5 years, but the oldest known one is about 37 years. This bird was banded at Middlenack Island, so one of the Vancouver Island nesting sites in 1966. It died sometime before 2006 when its body was found and the leg band was found. You might be wondering how long it takes for a glaucous winged gull to reach adulthood. And the answer to this is 4 years. So they go through a series of 4 cycles before they are considered to be mature adults. Here we have, just to review again, the topography of a gull there. But yeah, so gulls molt 2 times a year and they have 4 cycles. So 4 years before they fully mature. The They have a one complete molt, which is called the prebasic molt in the fall through that is complete by the fall and winter. And this produces what in the adults is the non-breeding plumage. And then in the spring, they have another molt known as the pre-alternate molt. This is just the head and the shoulders. So head, body, scapulars. I like to think head and shoulders will produce this breeding plumage. This alternate plumage is called. And the same holds true when they're young. So only in their first year are they properly termed a juvenile. So the bird here is considered a juvenile gull. In other years, like this one is called a second cycle gull. So this would still be considered immature, but not juvenile. And so this process repeats itself 4 times before they are considered to be an adult. So as a juvenile, it takes about 6 weeks for them to molt from their natal down feathers to their first basic juvenile plumage. And by then they are capable of flight. They can stick around their nest for up to 8 weeks, but after that they can be on their own, but they sometimes are still following their parents around. What we have here is juvenile gull, but this one actually has a bit of the Western gull influence because many of our breeding gulls are hybrids like this one. One thing to note is that when they're young, they also have longer pointed primaries and a marbling pattern of the coverts, which is more prominent in these Western gull hybrids than it is in the pure glaucous winged gull. This was a picture I took at some point in January one year. So even up after about 6 or so months, the chicks are still sometimes dependent on their parents for food. They'll still follow their parents around and be like, feed me. And this adult eventually regurgitated a crab for the chick to eat. So by the first fall and winter, they have their first partial molt of feathers. This is the head and shoulders, head and scapulars. which is quite variable, but generally it's a paler coloration with the scapulars being this kind of bluish gray. And it tends to be paler in the glaucous winged gulls as well as the hybrids with the American herring than it is with the Olympic gulls. So the Western gull hybrids, the Olympic gulls, tend to be darker in this molt compared to the pure glaucous winged gulls. And the same holds true for the cook inlet gull, the hybrid with the herring, but this is quite variable. So you can see there's two different variants here. And this is a pure herring gull juvenile. And then next we move on to the next cycle. So this is the second basic plumage. So the second complete molt. And it's usually initiated by the inner wings where the primaries are molted from the inside to out. So in the summer, they still outwardly look like a first cycle gull. They still are retaining all these juvenile feathers throughout the body. But by June is usually when they start. They're already kind of midway through the cycle molt there. And at the bottom is when it's complete. So this mostly complete, but the wing primaries have still not grown yet. So this is what the basic plumage looks like. And it overall looks less scaly than the first cycle. It's more of a smoother kind of marbled pattern. And then again, they have this head and shoulders molt, this alternate molt, where by the next spring, their head and scapulars actually look quite adult-like. They also have this bicolored bill through the winter, and by the spring, it becomes this yellowish color. And this is an image comparing the first and the second cycle during winter. So you can see that the first cycle is more scaly looking, more spotted body pattern compared to the second cycle, which has a smoother, more marbled appearance. And next up, we have the third cycle. This one is a hybrid. So it's hard to find pictures of all pure birds, but the same thing holds true for the hybrids as well. But this is the start of the third cycle. So this bird is mostly in its second cycle still, second alternate, but it has started its third cycle. This is in June 2023. And you can see the inner primaries are new feathers. They're quite adult-like looking with this kind of pale bluish gray coloration. And so by fall, this molt is completed, but the bill color will actually regress. So this yellow bill will actually go back to being a duller color with blackish striping on the tip. And again, it repeats for the third alternate where the head and the scapulars are molted again, and it looks very adult-like. This is also a hybrid with Western gull. You can see the dark wingtips and the tail. So at this point, it looks very adult-like, except that there are some dark feathers on the wing coverts here, and also on the primaries and on the tail. And usually by the fourth cycle, most birds are what we consider to be adults. Although there's some birds where it still looks somewhat more immature looking. So they can have more black on the bill, or they can have some darker spots on the wing coverts. But generally, this is considered to be breeding age at fourth cycle. And again, this is the adult plumage of the basic non-breeding plumage compared to the alternate breeding plumage here, where the main difference is the head is more smudgy in the non-breeding plumage compared to the breeding alternate plumage. And the coloration is also brighter as well, but that is controlled independently of the molt. So just a bit about gull importance and conservation. So they are opportunists and scavengers. They kind of act like the cleanup crew for the environment. Um, so one thing that they do is they like to eat sea urchins, and that's one thing that there have been studies that show that about a third of sea urchin populations can be controlled by the gull predation, and this increases algae cover and overall biodiversity in environments. So that's one way that gulls contribute to the local ecology positively. Um, Although gulls are quite abundant, their overall populations have decreased in some places, and this could be due to lower quality food and changing availability. And there's also been a shift towards these urban environments, but it remains to be seen, for example, if there's more hybrids as a result of these changing breeding behaviors. And it seems like the colony populations aren't really being replaced sufficiently by gulls relocating to urban environments. So there's a few ways you can help with gull conservation. You can report your gull sightings to citizen science platforms like eBird and iNaturalist. Another way is that recently Environment and Climate Change Canada have been doing a long-term project on gulls of the Salish Sea. So many of these gulls have been leg banded, and they have these easily recognizable color bands that you can report on a website. So um, I'll send you the website later, but this is one way that you can help out with studying gulls. And this bird actually was quite interesting that this glaucous wing type gull, many of them are actually Olympic gulls, so most of them are hybrids. But this one I actually saw in two different locations. I saw this gull at Stanley Park one day, and then on another day I saw it at Thornton Park near Main Street Station. And here's another gull that they banded. This one's actually quite interesting looking. This is a depigmented, or some people describe them as leucistic, but the proper term is depigmentation, where the body of the gull is completely white. The mantle doesn't have any coloration at all. And this gull was actually banded. I just learned this today from the researchers I emailed. This was actually banded as a first cycle gull back in 2022. Now it's in its fourth cycle, so it's basically adult, but it still has some dark feathers on its tail tip. So it's interesting to see these gulls are also banded in the study. There's actually probably one or two other gulls in the area before this bird, probably siblings from other generations or even the parents. So that was interesting to see. It took me 8 times visiting West Van. So this is at Ambleside Park to actually finally find this gull. I knew it was around. People have told me about it. It was quite exciting to actually find it. So I think that wraps it up for my presentation. If you're curious about other resources for gulls. There's these ones here. There is the Herring Gulls World. This is a great book about gull behavior. There's the Gull Guide by Amar Ayash, which was recently published. And one of our volunteers with Stanley Park Ecology, Ethan Moon, recently made this great app called Gullable, which features the gulls of the Pacific Northwest. And you can find this app on both Android and iOS. So thank you all for coming today. I'll be here for some questions.
That's great, Frank. Thank you so much. Let me just go back and ask the question that came in earlier. How did you identify that juvenile glaucous wing gull type versus, sorry, I'm not good with these acronyms, AHGU?
Oh, so that's the American herring gull type. Okay. I'll bring it the juvenile types. Okay, so
And I think the earlier question from Stephanie about what about the Canadian herring gull was answered because you talked about that later on. But if not, Stephanie, feel free to speak up and ask.
well, I think they're just meaning that the name was named as American herring gull instead of Canadian. That's just how it was named after they decided to split them, but it's very American centric, you could say. But yeah, so in terms of the juveniles, I'll bring that slide back up. Oh, I actually have a kind of a review slide here at the very end here. So these are various juvenile type gulls, just to generalize, but these are all in their first cycle. There is variation, so it's not always the be all end all of their appearances, but this is what we would call a glaucous wing crossed with American herring. or Cook Inlet gull in its first winter. And generally, they have a quite a more dainty appearance than the glaucous wing gulls. This glaucous wing gull is very bleached, so usually by the first winter, there's a lot of bleaching or abrasion of the plumage that they look paler. But in the case of both the glaucous wing and the um, American herring hybrids, the Cook Inlet gulls, they tend to look quite pale on the head. And but in the case of the hybrid, the Cook Inlet, the primaries are still quite dark, so they still have a darker gray than the more uniform color of the glaucous wing here. Whereas the Olympic gull or glaucous wing western gull tends to be a dark coloration. I hope that helps.
And then earlier you had a picture of the sea lions. You said it was the sea lions were staring at a lifer. I think it was a glaucous gull, which is all white.
Yeah,
And then the question was, would a sea lion take a gull in general, I think.
I think it's possible, but I didn't see that happen, so I'm not too sure if that is really that common.
Okay. Um, and then in the comments, you can see there's lots of appreciation for your presentation and great photos and wonderful videos. Here's a question from Christine. So is that banding project only glaucous wing gulls or hybrids?
Yeah, so the project, as far as I can tell, they only banded glaucous wing gulls, but they kind of banded them collectively. So most of the ones, like when they ban birds, they get this federal ban, and there's no hybrids listed in the federal database. So it's USGS and Canada combined together. They have this federal database throughout North America. But in the case of the banding, they would be primarily banded as glaucous wing gull because there's no hybrid listing. Most of them were identified as glaucous wing gull types. So I guess that's one of the drawbacks of this type of study is that there are some limitations into how birds are labeled in these databases. Maybe the researchers did take note of hybridization, but that is something they're kind of doing after the fact. So some of them were genetically tested, and then there's a University of Lethbridge in Alberta. They're doing a genetic study to see the extent of hybridization.
Mm, okay. One question I have actually is like we see so many glaucous wing gulls here. So for us it's I don't know, 90% that we see here. But what is the percentage of glaucous wing gulls in the world of gulls? Like what is the dominance in the world?
I mean, so I mentioned how glaucous wing gulls are found throughout the northern Pacific. This is their geographic range.
Mhm.
And so they're the predominant gull in these areas. And so, for example, here we have both migratory and resident populations. And up here, they're predominant over here as well, like in the middle, where they're less likely to hybridize with the other species. But they are kind of, you could say that they're predominant in that they hybridize with some of the most number of gull species.
Okay.
Um, I'll have to look up that number exactly, like what's the population of percentage here in BC compared to the world.
That'll be interesting. Um, So about the Gullible app, I would really like to know what it's about, actually. It's my first time hearing it. And I see Ethan is here. So either you or Ethan maybe just pipe up and tell us about this Gullible app. Sounds very interesting.
Yeah, so basically an app that I have it on my phone as well. It's really good in that it talks about the different goals that we have here and It goes into the different molting cycles as well. It's a pretty detailed app, but it's also pretty readily accessible as well.
I remember seeing the herring spawning over in the Vancouver Island. It was so amazing. It was like all these gulls just diving into the water. Hmm.
Yeah, I remember. So we don't really get much herring here in Vancouver, and there was some hope that maybe it was herring they were eating. But based on the pictures I got, and I can't say for sure this is all the fish there were, but it seems like most, if not all of them, were anchovies. Some news reports kind of got it wrong early on. Even we weren't sure what they were at first. Um, but it seems like these were northern anchovies that were coming up north because we had this kind of El Nino year. I remember, I think it was back in 2019, 2020, there was a similar thing happening at White Rock. So right down the pier, there was like also a big run. There was like 5,000 gulls, mostly glaucous wing hybrids, as well as a few of the I think there was one glaucous gull there at one point, but it was kind of very brief. And there was also dozens of these California sea lions foraging.
Yeah, it's really quite cool to see like the food web coming together. They're going for these small little fish, and then there's seagulls and sea lions. It's really quite amazing. And sometimes the eagles are circling around as well. And Ethan said that he started learning about gulls in the last few years and felt that Merlin didn't provide enough detailed information about molts, different ages. And Frank got me interested in gulls in the first place. Yeah, it's certainly tricky with the different cycles and yeah, it is very tricky and confusing, like people said in the very beginning. So thank you so much for sharing your information. And Justin suggested you should do a gull walk.
And that would be interesting. We did do something like this last year, so hopefully we can do one in the near future as well.
Mhm. Yeah, very cool. Lisa, go ahead. You've got your hand up.
Basic question about the molting process. What happens? Like, what does that look like? Is it kind of gradual, a little bit at a time, or is it, um, I've heard the term catastrophic molt. How does that work?
So it is quite gradual in gulls. It takes quite a few months. Often we consider the beginning of a cycle when they start to molt their part of their wing feathers, like the inner primaries are starting to molt, and that's kind of the start of the next cycle. But see if we can bring up that slide again. So the cycle mainly refers to kind of the year that the gull relative to the bird's year, which is different from calendar year. Calendar year is how we perceive a year on the calendar, and some people use that to denote birds like the first winter, but the first winter gull or the first summer is technically its second year. So it gets really confusing when you use calendar years sometimes. So cycles are more relative to the bird's age. Just give me a second, I can show you that slide. So it is a drawn out process, and sometimes the molts are also suspended or protracted, which means that they will kind of stop or they will kind of stop this molt and they start the next one. They also overlap with them. So it gets pretty complicated. But here's the second cycle, so like the second year of the gull and through the winter, where this is the second, mostly in the second basic village. We call this, but it has started the alternate molt, and the way that you can tell is that there's this bluish coloration coming in from the scapulars. So this is the beginning of the molt, and this takes place anywhere between September to April. So this is December, so it's kind of midway through this molt. But at the end of this alternate molt, they actually look quite adult-like overall. So this bird is at the end of the second alternate molt, second pre-alternate molt. which produces second alternate plumage. And so it has this white head and this grayish scapulars like an adult, but the rest of the body is still in the basic plumage. I'm not
Thank
sure
you.
if that made more sense.
Yeah,
No
and then
problem.
the question I have though is like, are the feathers that are molting transforming or are they like getting new feathers?
They're getting new feathers.
Okay. Thanks.
There's a comment back here from Helen. She says that she always liked enjoying seeing your photos on BC Bird Photographer on Facebook. And in the beginning, you gave us your Instagram handle. So my question to you, Frank, is do you post the same, like, because I use Instagram and I don't look at Facebook. So my question is, do you post the same pictures on both sites?
I try to. So I feel like in recent times, I haven't really posted much on Facebook. I feel like just Instagram is easier to share things. So nowadays, I think my main sharing platform is either Instagram or the Macaulay Library. And there's a link to that in my Instagram link
Hmm.
to the site. So that's where I post all my eBird observation photos.
Okay,
And it's
great.
also good because it's a good way to like contribute to the citizen community science, and people can see the pictures there and rate them, and they can also see like the behaviors, and there's also videos there as well.
Cool. All right. Um, so Ethan was saying that he's glad can share his fascination about birds with people through the app, the Gullible app. Christine asked, when do the parents stop supporting the chicks? I saw a chick being fed just a few weeks ago at Kids Beach.
Hmm, that's a good question. Um, I think I remember seeing her pictures. That was actually quite interesting because usually it only takes place for a few months. It could be that we are kind of in a more urbanized environment that could have some influence on that. I'm not too sure exactly what's going on, but usually within the first year, you could say that they become independent. And if they ever get lost and they lose their parents, find, they'll eventually try to find food on their own.
Mhm. I know that in my building there is a nest on the roof. I can't see it, so I wonder what their nests look like. They keep flying on top of the building.
So I've only seen a few nests that aren't very clear. They're usually quite distant. I think I had a picture of one of the nests. So the top picture, you can see all these twigs and sticks that they gather together. And this one's in the shade at least in some times of the day. I'm
Mhm.
hoping tomorrow I'll get some more pictures because I'm not sure if they really started much up on the rooftops, but I got these pictures when we were doing our rooftop heron survey. So we were looking for the great blue herons in Stanley Park, kind of overlooking that area. But then on the other side, you can sometimes see the gulls nesting as well.
Mhm. Cool. Thanks. Okay. Are there any other questions? If not, I think we should wrap it and let Frank go.